Hello, my name is Frank Hillary, and I'm a professor of psychology and neurology at Penn State University. And I was delighted to be invited to contribute to ENIGMA-U's neuropsychology series by Dr. Emily Dennis at University of Utah. And this brief segment will focus on visual spatial perception and construction. So what I wanted to start with is just quickly defining what is cortex. So spend a lot of time about talking in the next 10, 15 minutes about visual spatial perception and information processing cortically, mostly in cortex. And so the cortex has 6 layers of cells with different types of neurons. The pyramidal, the cell bodies are pyramid shaped, and they have large dendritic trees which extend from the top of the pyramid to the cortex surface, and the stellate, which are star-shaped and interneurons. And so we talk about, often you'll hear people describe different parts of the brain, such as dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex or ventral medial temporal lobe. And this just gives you an overview of what that means. So dorsal or superior is the top or up, rostral or anterior is toward the front, ventral or inferior is toward the bottom, and caudal or posterior is toward the back. And if somebody says medial, it means toward the center of the brain. You can't see it from the outside. And so just keep those in mind, and you can use this slide to help orient you to where we're talking about with regard to the cortex. The cortex is a nice heuristic for how it's organized. Is it has primary areas and associative areas. And the primary areas are focused on very hardwired, preordained sort of functionality that has less individual difference. So the visual cortex, the motor cortex, auditory cortex, you can find them all in roughly the same places in everybody's brain. The associative areas are those areas that fill in more by experience. So our brain is wiring over the course of our lifetime, and part of that is determined by genetics. But part of it is also, of course, determined by our exposure to the environment. And so the association areas bring together what's happening in the primary areas and intermix or combine, integrate different types of information. So I mentioned the motor area here in the green, the somatosensory area here in the red. So the motor is gross motion or motor movement, such as moving your hand. Sensory area is the sensation in your hand, on your skin. If it's touched or you bump against something, you can feel it. Primary visual cortex, or V1, is in the back, and so on. And so those are the primary areas. What you'll find is the association cortex fills in all around these areas. And similar types of information are processed in nearby locations. The brain's organized so that similar types of information are nearby. You don't want to be jumping all around the brain in order to process what is in front of you, or what food tastes like, or what sound you just heard. And so we're going to focus on parietal functioning and the ventral stream and the temporal lobe with regard to visual systems. So information comes in through the retina, crosses over the optic chiasm, which you can't see in this image, goes to the LGN, the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus, and then there's spreads out and ends up here at V1. V1 is the most basic type of information processing. We're not going to focus too much on that. That's more sensation than perception. We want to talk about more complex visual processing after it gets to V1. How is it combined so that we can make decisions about the world? And there are 2 pathways in general after it gets to V1. The first is the dorsal stream, and the next is the ventral stream. And this is an oversimplification that the dorsal stream is where, and the ventral stream is what. But those are just general guidelines to help you think about the types of information that would be processed here in the parietal lobe and here in the temporal lobe. So think of the parietal lobe as processing information that has a spatial dimension to it. And the temporal lobe is more associated with language, semantics, context, and therefore it can help answer what, where the dorsal stream is going to answer where. And so the most basic information processing is in V1, the visual cortex, occipital lobe. And then we begin to integrate more complex information in these two streams. And so the dorsal stream, again, is spatial representation and reasoning, and the ventral stream can result in agnosia when it's disrupted. And agnosia means the inability of your unawareness to recognize something. And so this unawareness it's most commonly the result of a posterior hemisphere stroke. And again, it's most commonly in this ventral stream. And so if we have disruption in the dorsal stream, we will have a very different set of problems than if we have a disruption in the ventral stream. And so part of that, the research in the cognitive neurosciences, understanding our ability to recognize objects, and in particular faces, has focused on a region called the fusiform gyrus. And it had, at one point, it was even called the fusiform face area, because it was believed that the fusiform gyrus was almost solely responsible for recognition of faces. That's been elaborated upon quite a bit. But the idea is that in this ventral stream, information processing is occurring in specific to what is the object. That's the most important information it can integrate. And fusiform area is often really specifically, not specifically, but often related to facial processing. And so agnosias there's different subtypes. There's objects, difficulty naming an object, faces or prosopagnosia. That's the inability to recognize even faces for individuals who are well known. Faces, when you think about it, we recognize people's faces very quickly, people that we know, even we've only met a couple of times, but faces often have very similar features, eyes, nose, mouth, and their spatial arrangement is quite consistent. And so this is a skill, the ability to recognize a face. And somebody with prosopagnosia sees the elements of the face, but they no longer have the same spatial representation or information associated with the face, and therefore they can't be recognized. Also colors. We may have agnosia for color that is not at the level of the peripheral system or color blindness. You may lose the ability to recognize colors. And so there's a really wonderful book for anybody who, it's older now, but it's still and something even when I was in graduate school, this was a book that people often reference with regard to agnosias. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And what this series of stories is about from Oliver Sacks are neurological conditions. And one is about agnosias, where a neurologist is meeting with a patient, and toward the end of the conclusion of the appointment, the man stands up and reaches for his hat, but it's actually his spouse, and grabs the top of her head because he doesn't really recognize objects as well as he did before. And then he's a bit confused for a moment and understands that what he did was not, it didn't make much sense. So this is a really wonderful resource for anybody who wants to do additional reading. So what happens then, we talked a little bit about the ventral stream with agnosias. What happens to disruption to the dorsal stream? And this is more related to visual spatial perception. So spatial representation of stimuli, visual spatial attention, and visual spatial construction, or the ability to copy or draw. And so we were talking about V1 back here and integration of information in the temporal lobe. Now we're going to focus on the parietal lobe and information. The parietal system is involved in awareness of somatosensory information, and that's right here, postcentral gyrus, primary somatosensory cortex, but also analyzing and recognizing memory of somatic sensation. So memories for these sorts of stimuli are also formed. That's responsible in processing that type of information, but also proprioception, or the ability to understand where your body is in space, and also spatial and body awareness. So understanding where things are around you in space and attending to them. And so how do we assess visual perception? This is one really common test, the judgment of line orientation. And what you would give the patient is an array like this at the bottom, and then two smaller lines, and they have to give you the two numbers that would most closely represent those two lines. And in this case, we have 6, this would be 6, and this line here would be 3. And so, and there'd be multiple stimuli. And somebody who's having trouble might have for example, parietal lobe injury would struggle with determining the orientation of these lines. Again, parietal lobe dysfunction can also affect your visual spatial construction, your ability to draw, understanding the relationships between the lines in space and your ability to link them together. And so copying a very simple stimulus like this or this table or even this clock can be quite challenging for somebody with a posterior injury, in particular to parietal lobe. There's another really interesting phenomenon called visual spatial neglect, and that is also from a parietal lobe injury. And this is really a loss of awareness of a hemispace. So it's not only the space in front of you as you represent it, but your own body, the space of your body. And it's often due to a posterior or parietal injury, and it's attributed to attention. So it's an inattention. It's not that you can't appreciate those stimuli if you were oriented to them, you just often ignore them if left to your own devices. And so in normal vision, we have a crossover. So this is the right hemisphere, this is the left hemisphere, this is space out in front of us. This crossover is more predominantly right hemisphere, paying attention to left hemispace, but the right hemisphere actually also pays attention a bit to the right. The left focuses more on the right hemispace, which means that if you have a right hemisphere lesion that essentially removes this attentional source, you will focus almost solely on the right hemispace. If you remove the left hemisphere, then you will focus more so on the left hemispace with some right hemisphere representation. So what we commonly see in neurology, in acute patient rehab from stroke, could be traumatic brain injury or other source of injury to parietal systems, is if it's a left hemisphere injury, something called right hemi neglect can often occur. And what that means is that because, remember, if the right hemisphere is removed and the left hemisphere is the only source of input or focus, it's not that you can't see what's over here, but you have no representation or no push to attend to left hemisphere, the left hemispace. And what ends up happening then is if you ask somebody with a page filled with these lines to just turn them all into X's or just line bisect them, the patient will focus almost solely on the right side of the page. So it's this loss of awareness of hemispace or body. It could also be their own body. They may neglect part of their body due to posterior or parietal injury. And there's a range of examples of this. So in this set of boxes in A, this is the stimulus and this is the copy. This is the stimulus and a copy is a half of a flower. And then for a clock, just draw a clock from memory. So this is, you can see it's not just focusing on the right side, but it's also the spatial representation of the clock is distorted. And then if asked to focus on this small sun-like symbol in an array of many different symbols, individuals will focus on the right side of this page. This is quite extreme, in fact. And then if given a line here in D, if given a line and asked, bisect that right in the middle, well, you'll end up typically seeing it's bisected at about a quarter. So it's a half of a half, right? Because the rest of the stimulus is not appreciated. And so on. And there's a reference here for some more examples. Visual spatial neglect is, it is treatable, and it is often not permanent with some residual deficits, but it's quite striking clinically. So just as a summary of our quick overview of visual spatial functioning, visual processing is distributed pathways, and there's dorsal stream and the ventral stream. Remembering that the dorsal stream gives you information more about space or where something is, and the ventral stream integrates information, visual information with regard to what, or semantic information, or how something is processed, or how something acts. And the parietal lobe in particular is responsible for somatosensory and spatial visual spatial construction, and visual attention. And loss of input from the right hemisphere, so the left hemisphere is dominant, can result in inattention or neglect. And then finally, complex visual integration or enignosia after a temporal lobe stroke can result in the inability to recognize faces, objects, colors. All those are examples of agnosia. And again, that is a ventral stream injury where you're losing information in the visual processing system about what an object is. Okay, I think that is it. Thank you so much for listening for this quick overview. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email is on the front slide. Have a good afternoon.